Welcome to this EDUcast, Cloud to Endpoint Made Simple. Our theme today is build a robust, secure, cost-effective Power over Ethernet platform for hosted IP. This EDUcast is sponsored by NVT FiBridge. Today's speakers are John Koshy, CEO of NVT FiBridge, and I'm Gary Auden. And as we always do, we talk about our agenda. We're going to be talking about the in-house challenges of networking today, modern LAN principles and how to apply them, moving from the traditional LAN for IoT into an IP LAN, what it means to do an IP upgrade, and we're going to talk about principle number 1 of the modern LAN. Then focus on end user opinions, and as many people ask the question, is TDM more reliable than IP? And then we're going to spend some time thinking about LAN switches themselves. So let's start off with the first slide. I like this quote from Einstein, but what do you mean by this quote?
Well, I always like to use this quote in presentations, but also in life in general, because we're constantly being bombarded by disruptive change. And when we look at the whole world of the Internet of Things, specifically the network and the way in which we connect endpoints back to the application, we've had a long period of time where the only endpoints being connected to the switch fabric were data terminals. So we establish through our education best practices. However, what tends to happen whenever you have disruptive innovations and new things happening, we tend to sometimes forget that to accept some learnings on better ways in which to create better outcomes. So we tend to always allow our best practices and historical view of things get in the way of our acceptance of maybe a better way to do things.
On this next slide, the left side looks plain and simple. You go to the cloud. But on the right side, there are challenges. What are the challenges for in-house in our networks?
Well, see, the big challenge is, especially when it comes to hosted solutions, is that the hosted providers have figured out how to get the application to the demarc point of the building. But the issue is, how do I get effective connectivity to the endpoint in which I'm looking to enable? Specifically, when we're looking at cloud voice, it's that phone that's sitting on everyone's desk or somewhere within the location. Those are the challenges. Is the how do I create a robust, effective connectivity?
It's been many years people have been putting in local area networks, but Frost and Sullivan has come up with their concept of the modern LAN. What are the principles?
Well, it's interesting. Frost and Sullivan did some research on organizations that took a different approach than the traditional approach to getting your network ready to support the Internet of Things. And because everyone is fully aware of some of the challenges that customers face, so they came out with these principles as a result of their learnings from organizations that took a different approach to the way in which they modernized their network to support the Internet of Things. And what I would encourage is individuals to go to the www.themodernlan.org to get some additional information on the background to the modern LAN principles and some additional learnings.
You use the word traditional. What are some of the issues with the traditional LAN?
Well, actually, there are no issues with traditional LAN per se in the sense of connecting data terminals. The challenges came as a result of the mindset of our education and best practices, given we've been viewing things from connecting data terminals, because the first multi-port data switch was introduced in 1989-90 by a company called Calpana, who was later purchased by Cisco, and for 15 years the only thing connected were data terminals. So the focus was, how do I get more bandwidth and connectivity to those data terminals? But the last 15 years, with the introduction of the IP phone being the first of those terminals, new devices are being connected to those switches. But the thought process of network readiness was from that traditional mindset. That's the education, where as a result of this rip and replace requirement, the customers start having challenges around building their robust network. Higher cost, complexity, security. We're hearing about incredibly large organizations having significant data breaches. And of course, this is a big concern for customers. Quality of service, deployment, disruption, reliability of the network, the demands on the skill sets of their team, of course, the return on investment. And the challenge for organizations with multiple locations is that every single location's data network is not the same, given the dynamics of the kind of bandwidth demands and endpoints being connected to that network.
When we talk about the traditional LAN and upgrade to IP, what problems do we encounter?
Well, again, when you look at the traditional thinking is we need to rip and replace all of our infrastructure and connect those new IoT endpoints on our core network switch fabric that's sitting in the IDF closets today. And that is the traditional way of thinking. And as a result of that requirement, customers and organizations are asked to rip and replace that infrastructure, meaning new cabling, additional costs associated with that cable, IDF closet costs, backup power considerations, and then, of course, the disruption to the business and the demands on IT staff. These are things that impact the customers' decisions around moving to the Internet of Things, given this traditional methodology of getting there.
How did Frost & Sullivan change this conversation then?
Well, they came up with these modern LAN principles because they're saying, you know what, don't let your education get in the way of your learning. There are ways, better, more innovative ways that allow you to get to your desired endpoint. And they have proof through these customers that they've researched. So they came out with these principles, and the first principle is instead of thinking of the switch capability out, and it's interesting, you know, you talk to every customer about when customers come and see us at trade shows and they talk about, hey, is your switch a gigabit switch? The immediate thing I ask is, well, what's the endpoint you're looking to deploy on the switch fabric, and why is gigabit important to you? But you can see from their first question, is a gigabit switch, is that paradigm of thinking from the switch out. Frost & Sullivan's first principle is think from the endpoint back, meaning what is the bandwidth requirements? What is the characteristic of that bandwidth? For example, voice is latency sensitive. What are the power requirements of those endpoints? What's the impact on my core network when I add those endpoints to my network, and the potential negative impact on security and performance?
Would you review some of the modern LAN principles for us that Frost & Sullivan came up with?
Sure. Again, we talked about start with the endpoint requirements first. The other one is build a sustainable LAN strategy, meaning don't view just the endpoints you're deploying today. View at the long-term impacts of the strategy you're taking today into the future. To give you an example, specifically around voice. When IP voice first came out, there was over 100 million 10100 IP phones. So when I say 10100, that means the bandwidth speed available to connect to the phone your data device, right? But today, everyone, every customer, every organization is talking about getting gigabit to the desktop. Well, now if I'm using a topology where I'm daisy chaining my data terminal to my phone that's sitting on the desk to get my connectivity to the network, that 10100 phone is now an issue for me. I now have to replace that phone with a 10100 1000 phone or a gigabit phone. So it makes no good sense long term to develop a strategy where you're dependent on a certain endpoint like a phone to get higher bandwidth given the evolving needs of my data terminal connected to it. So that principle is all about think long-term about the strategy you're taking today. Obviously, when you're putting your network, never compromise security and ensure you're building a secure, robust network. Be environmentally responsible during that modernization, meaning to the extent you have the ability to leverage what you already have that's proven, try to leverage that if you can. Always keep an eye on your ROI. Maximize that return on investment and ensure that you're allocating your investments in the right area, and then leverage innovation.
You talked about the old terminals being the common device we connect to. Why should we start thinking with the Internet of Things rather than the old terminal viewpoint?
15, 20 years ago, 90%, if not more, of the desktop terminals were actually fixed on the desk, where you're connecting via the wire back to the data switch. But today, more and more businesses are going to laptops as opposed to desktop terminals, which means that even my data connectivity is moving to a wireless network, because not only do I have my laptop, I have a tablet, and I have my a smartphone being connected via a wireless connection. And the only wired connection is that wireless access point. So when you start with the Internet of Things, you're really going, hey, what are my bandwidth requirements? What are my power requirements of the endpoint I'm adding? What's the impact on my business? Meaning, am I adding an endpoint that's core to the business outcome or supportive? To give you an example, you're looking to deploy an IP cameras within your organizations. And now, understanding, yes, you can VLAN that off of your core switch, but now recognize if you're not addressing backup power strategies, you may be taking your uptime from hours to minutes because you didn't take into consideration the power consumption of those new endpoints relative to the endpoints you already have on the network. Then you also have to look at the impact on the network, the management complexity, performance impact, uptime, security, expertise of your team. So when you think from the endpoint first, you start to think of these things before you worry about whether the switch has a gigabit port.
Now, you've talked about IoT things, but a lot of people don't really realize that when they add IP phones, they're simply doubling the number of devices they have to put on LAN switches. Would you focus on the IP phones for us?
This was the first real-time application that was being layered on the network, and that the network that was designed for a near-time application, and we could all remember the hourglass before the file would actually open. Now it's a little round circle that continues to go round and round until the file opens. And it's because that near-time application, the packets are disassembling, reassembling, and then the file opens. But with voice, of course, that's a real-time application. So as a result, that phone, we need to understand the characteristics of that phone. So it's real-time. It's little bandwidth, 100K of bandwidth gets you enough bandwidth to support voice, but it's latency sensitive. So if I have issue with those packets traveling, business stops, because if I can't understand you on the other end of the line, I have major issues. You also have power requirements, and that endpoint is supportive to your business, but very important to making your business happen. There's significant network demands because an inefficient network will be exposed given this real-time application requirement, which leads to quality of service. Also, the application exposes the inefficiencies as mentioned. And network providers, the challenge for many large organizations, and I've seen this many times in the past, is you get a lot of finger pointing, where the network provider of the organization is not the same provider responsible for the voice solution within that organization. The voice provider, who's being blamed for a poor voice experience, is dependent on the network provider to ensure the network delivers the right topology and the right network capabilities to support that real-time application.
We're talking here on this page of 5 different items that end users and providers agree on. Would you cover those for us?
Which of the two, a TDM point or an IP point, point delivers 5 nines reliability, is more secure, delivers quality of service, has less support issue. 10 out of 10 of that audience says the TDM phone. Yet the future is IP. So what we're in essence saying is, I don't have as much confidence in my IP phone delivering the same level of experience as the TDM phone. So I challenge them to ask why. Why is that the case?
So why is it the case?
Well, if you take a look at the next slide, the question becomes, is it technology or is it topology? And that's the question, because the phone itself, if you take the actual inner workings of a TDM phone versus an IP phone, there isn't that much of a difference to make that TDM phone actually better. In fact, I would argue, given the capabilities of the IP phone, in the sense of HD voice quality, the IP phone should be a better performing phone. So it's not the technology, it's the topology. You see, the idea of the phone being deployed within organizations, the initial topology was designed for that real-time application, meaning it's point-to-point. From the endpoint all the way back to where all the application resides, or the router for hosted solution, is a dedicated wire for each and every endpoint. What that means is packets travel in order, on time, without contention or loss. The data network was designed for a near-time delivery application, more of a mesh network, meaning packets disassemble, go amongst the different switches within the network topology, and then reassemble and open. So the topology of the initial voice solution, which all TDM phones were layered on, resulted in the better experience. Nothing to do with the topology. Yet we're asking our customers to actually go and accept the fact that you need to rip and replace that proven infrastructure to get the benefits of your IP phone.
How does NVT enable the modern LAN today?
If we agree that topology is critical, being that existing point-to-point is what delivered the great experience, well, what Frost and Sullivan indicated about leveraging innovation in network design and PoE capabilities, we are one of the companies that have those kind of PoE innovations in the marketplace. We're the first company that came out with a switch that delivered Ethernet and PoE over a single pair of wire with extended reach.
So let's go talk about the traditional switches and then make a comparison to what you think is a modern switch.
Excellent. Well, the traditional switches, you have what I call the standard and the enterprise grade solutions. And over the years, what the developments have been focused predominantly on bandwidth capabilities, and going from 10 to 10100 to gig to the future being 10 gig. And the focus on delivering higher bandwidth. And then, of course, the introduction of PoE also supporting power over that cable infrastructure. But one thing that's common amongst all traditional switches is the reach limitations of 100 meters and the kind of cable infrastructure and the number of pairs required to support that connectivity.
Why do we need to go beyond the traditional LAN switch then?
Well, it's because of the Internet of Things, the movement to the Internet of Things, and the need to create connectivity for these different endpoints resulted in the need of finding ways to complement your traditional LAN strategy, but allow you to modernize to the Internet of Things in the more efficient way. So that's what we came out with, is we are innovators in PoE capabilities. So we have switches that deliver Ethernet and PoE to 6,000 feet, whether it's coax, multi-pair, or single-pair UTP. We can support that connectivity. We have managed, unmanaged, and single-port solutions. Our managed switches come with enterprise-grade power and Ethernet and management capabilities. So these are meant to be a complement to your core network.
Now, this slide starts off with your Chariot Solutions. Would you take us through the thought process of dealing with the Chariot Solutions?
Sure. So again, what we talked about, the standard switch limitations. So let's say a customer had an IP camera or an IP phone that was a significant distance away. You would need multiple IDF closets between your standard switch because of that reach limitations, and multiple switches in those IDF closets to support that connectivity. But with our Chariot solutions, in this case, we're looking at the polar solution. We deliver Ethernet and PoE over one pair of UTP with 1200-foot reach. This was designed for IP voice, meaning you can leverage that proven single pair point-to-point voice infrastructure to deploy your IP phone. The next is our flex switch. Again, this is designed for those higher power IoT endpoints that we can deliver 100 meg symmetrical and PoE over multi-pair UTP, whether it's 2-pair or 4-pair, to 2,000-foot reach or 610 meters. And then we have our Clear family, which is the coax family. Again, this solution was designed for the modernization to IP cameras, because the majority of analog cameras are on a coax infrastructure, as well as the digital signage, which have coax, as well as TV, where there's a coax infrastructure. Give you an example where this is being used. We're partnering with an organization that is transforming the bedside TVs within hospitals to become smart TVs, where it's not only a TV and a phone for the patient, but for the hospital itself, it's actually an operating desktop computer where they can get all the intelligence on that patient as well. And they're using this Clear switch to IoT enable that endpoint.
The top of the slide has the term Smart Path PoE. Would you tell us what that technology is?
Yeah, that's the patented technology and the IP in which we have in our long-reach PoE solutions that make up the Chariot family of long-reach switches. So that's our IP that is able to deliver the PoE over those different cable types and that distance.
You added some items to the left side of this picture. What are those?
Yeah, those are our unmanaged solutions. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we have our managed switches, which is the main switches on this slide, but we also have unmanaged solutions that many customers use these as extender offerings, where I'll give you an example. Like if you look at that EC10, where there's 10 Ethernet over coax ports. Some customers have standardization on, let's say, Cisco switches. So instead of using our managed switches, they'll simply take a gigabit port of their standard switch, connected into the uplink ports of our EC10, and then leverage that coax, those 10 lines of coax run, to deploy their IP cameras. And those are the unmanaged, and then as mentioned, we have single port solutions as well.
Let's start off with LAN design, the initial LAN design that you propose.
This is a cross-section of an organization. There's 3 networks being shown here. There's the core network. We call it the profit and loss network. That's the network that is connecting users to the data that's driving the business forward. Then supporting that is the voice network. We talked about the point-to-point, and the physical security, being that network that's helping protect the organization and its people. So those networks are independent and separate, you know, in that initial LAN design concept. Again, what's critical to understand is that though they were purpose-built, meaning that point-to-point topology for that voice infrastructure was designed for voice, and that's why it's designed point-to-point.
Now let's apply the rules or principles of modern LAN design to what you were just talking about.
Right. So if you take a look at, start with the endpoint first. I have a voice endpoint. We agreed that the infrastructure had more to do with the incredibly great experience that customer had than the endpoint itself. So to the extent I can leverage that point-to-point topology, given I'm thinking of my endpoint first, now I got to find an innovation that can support that. Well, that's our polar switch. Our polar switch allows you to go and transform that voice infrastructure into a robust, secure PoE platform for your IP phones. So now you've created what we call the endpoint segmentation ability for different IoT endpoints within your organization, all now backed by these innovative switches. Now, the intention here, modern LAN principles are not to replace traditional LAN design, but more to complement and extend the LAN design to support the Internet of Things, given these new IP endpoints that are being deployed.
Now, a lot of our customers and a lot of viewers we're talking to today are thinking about the cloud or going to the cloud. How does the connection to the cloud influence this?
Well, when you think of the cloud offering, and this is critically important for customers to recognize, because many customers who have poor experiences when they move to a cloud voice or physical security fail to realize that it's not the connectivity necessarily from that cloud application to your DMARC, but it's the local area network. It's connecting from the DMARC to your desktop. So when you look at the cloud offering, if your cloud voice is the beauty of this topology, leveraging modern LAN and the polar innovations, is you're able to create a completely separate connectivity for those IP phones. So if I'm a cloud voice provider and I'm being held responsible for a good user experience, I want to make sure I have end-to-end control over everything that's going to impact that experience. So now with this strategy, I have end-to-end control. The alternative of layering my phone on the data network, I don't have end-to-end control because I'm not responsible for the data network of the customer and everything that they add to that network. Yet when a user picks up the phone and they have a poor experience, they immediately relate that poor experience to the voice provider. And that's the challenge that many face.
Now, you're talking about multiple sites in the typical organization. What's the commonality among these sites?
So when we look at the traditional topology of an organization, every single organization around the world has the exact same voice topology, being point-to-point in its legacy form. So given that with this innovation and the modern LAN principles, I can leverage that which is already proven reliable in every location around the world.
You know, implementing all these sites, that's a problem. Okay, how can we accomplish an easy, cost-effective deployment?
Well, again, when you look at this diagram and the fact that we're leveraging this common infrastructure topology being point-to-point with every endpoint having dedicated bandwidth for that phone, what you have is a repeatable, predictable, and scalable process across every location. So to give you an example of one that we did many years ago is the UK embassies and also Canadian embassies around the world were able to centrally kit the entire solution, meaning our polar switch with the IP solution, make sure everything worked in that one central location. When they knew that the kit was working properly, they sent that entire kit to every location in the world, and the only change was the wiring infrastructure connecting the endpoint back to the application. So they were able to apply this repeatable, predictable, and scalable process across every one of the locations, saving millions of dollars, accelerating their modernization, and being environmentally responsible as they did that.
You mentioned dollars. The problem today is budgets are always an issue for IT. How is the budget changing with modern LAN principles?
when you look at from a customer's perspective, you say there's three components. There's getting the infrastructure ready, there's the application, and there's the endpoints I'm connecting and application adoption. So the return on investment is based on the devices and application adoption. The network is supportive, but unfortunately, the rip and replace strategy is resulting in higher cost than anticipated often, as well as it's taking a significant amount of the budget. However, with modern LAN, what we're seeing is customers leveraging an existing infrastructure, leveraging the backup power strategy they already have for the legacy solution, leveraging the space in the MDF closet, and establishing the polar switch fabric for their IP voice solution in that closet allows them to save between 40 and 80% of the otherwise traditional methodology of rip and replace. What that means is you got more budget available for that which drives the ROI for the customer.
I haven't seen the word Centrex for quite a while, but it was a very successful model. How do we replicate the Centrex model?
To your point, Centrex was incredibly successful, both from an end user perspective, but also the provider. And that is, so when you look at the Centrex model, what was that? Well, they had end-to-end control from the desktop phone all the way back to the application sitting in the cloud was under the control of the provider. So therefore, they provided a great user experience. Every single location for those Centrex users, the topology was exactly the same, point to point. So now with our polar switch innovation, you can replicate that business model, leverage that proven topology, and deliver the exact same experience, but enhance the experience as it relates to the applications, given the IP, the new IP applications, as well as the capabilities of the new IP phone.
I see you have a case study of a federal housing agency. What did you accomplish there?
Yeah, this agency was looking to modernize in their aging TDM system. Again, they had many locations, so they had significant challenges in each of those those locations. The customer challenges that I pointed out early, pretty much every one of them were on the minds of this customer. So they wanted to move forward, but their challenge was the risk, the cost, having to rip and replace the infrastructure. They were able to leverage the existing infrastructure, reduce their cost by 1.2 million, and they were able to accelerate the modernization of it. And that was in every single location. So the result was incredibly successful.
Now, this is a completely different kind of solution. How did you help a retail operation?
Well, again, especially, distributed retail where they have a lot of locations and maybe a few endpoints. This was the case with this lending store, 150 locations. They took our unmanaged switch, the 8-port switch, leveraged the CAD3 and deployed 2 to 5 phones in every location, literally overnight.
Would you then summarize the success you're talking about?
It's important to embrace new learnings. What we've been talking about today is challenging the paradigm of the customer. And every customer, I challenge you to think of the fact that most of us are Uber users today. And Uber is simply an enhancement on taxi service of yesterday. Modern LAN principles and PoE innovations are simply an enhancement on traditional LAN thinking. Be willing to adopt and apply new proven approaches to solving IP modernization challenges. Again, thinking of the fact that we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking that was used to create the problem. And I'll give you an example of that. When voice quality was an issue of layering voice on the same traditional data switches, the paradigm of solving that problem from that paradigm was, oh, we'll create VLANs. And yes, we have solved that problem, but it's complex. Out-of-the-box thinking is, hey, the infrastructure is proven reliable. It's designed for voice. Why don't I create an innovation, PoE innovation, that could leverage that infrastructure? That's out of the box thinking and solving problems from a different approach than being in the problem. And then the last secret to success is leverage the modern LAN principles and PoE innovations that exist from companies like us and VT FiBridge.
Well, thank you very much, John. I'd like to mention a number of resources to learn more about the modern LAN and the success stories that you have. And I thank you again, John, for this very interesting EDUcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's great to be a part of it.